Over our past 4 classes, we have come to know much about the so-called ways and means of bhakti, the Bahiranga and Antaranga sadhanas, external means and internal means. The Bahiranga sadhanas, if you remember, the Bahiranga sadhanas were remembrance, worshipful service, and surrender. And the Antaranga sadhanas were renunciation, knowledge, and practice. In our last class, we were dealing with the broader aspects of this last one of them, last one of the internal means, that is practice. We were discussing the broader aspects of spiritual discipline, concentration and meditation, discipline and regularity. At the end of it, we heard that sadhana also includes certain important specifics like time of practice, food and sleep, posture and breathing. In all of these specifics, our teachers advise that one must be judicious. One must exercise some caution. They say it is best for us to follow the middle path. Now, it is after all spiritual life and spiritual practice. Why be cautious about it? Why be so calculative? The reason is not hard to see, but it is something we sometimes overlook. In our present state of consciousness, the way we now are, in this condition, our body and mind are very much interconnected. They depend upon one another and they affect each other. So we need to take care of both. That is why I mentioned the story of Buddha, how he discovered the middle path which avoids extremes. If it applied to somebody of Buddha's stature, how much more should it apply to us? The string overstretched breaks and the music flies. The string overslack is dumb and music dies. Tuneth the sitar neither low nor high. These are very famous lines from Edwin Arnold's well-known poem, The Light of Asia. Self-indulgence and self-punishment both have to be avoided. Too much is harmful and too less is not helpful. We heard the same advice from Krishna also, moderation and regulation. In the Bhagavad Gita we read, yoga is not for one who eats too much, nor for one who eats too little. It is not for one who sleeps too much, nor for one who sleeps too little. So how does one succeed in yoga? For one who is temperate in one's food and recreation, temperate in one's exertion at work, temperate in sleeping and waking, yoga puts an end to all sorrows. These are Krishna's words. So, nothing need be spectacular in sadhana. In the end, it is only quiet, steady work that counts. So, everything in moderation, that is the basic rule that applies to all the important specifics during the early stages. Time and duration of practice, food and sleep, work and recreation, these are all day-to-day things that have a direct influence on our sadhana. When we see what our spiritual teachers have to say in these matters, we will know how much maturity and wisdom, how much common sense, and more than all that, how much concern for our safety and welfare, how much of all this is there behind their apparently simple instructions. In one of his lectures, Swami Vivekananda says, truth is simple, but if I talked about it in a simple way, most of you would go away dissatisfied. Anyhow, now, as regards the time for japa and meditation, every devotee should practice at least 2 times a day. That we all know, morning and evening. But preferably around sunrise and sunset. Why? Especially during those times? Because whether we know it or not, just now we are quite insensitive to these spiritual matters. But at these times, both nature and the mind are set to become peaceful. This is something that the teachers have experienced themselves. They are speaking from experience. So, at these junctures of the day, there is a change in the flow of spiritual vibrations both inside and outside, whether we feel it or not. But of these 2 times, morning is the best. It is the best time for meditation. Because the night sleep will have erased or quieted many of our memories. So it is definitely easier to concentrate then. And also, during the early hours of the morning, the conscious mind is not fully active. So the unconscious part of the mind is more receptive. Whatever we give to our mind at that time, early morning, that sinks deep down into the unconscious. That is why the small hours of the morning, they are the most precious and should be fully utilized for japa and meditation. As for sleep, Swami Brahmanandaji says 5 hours. 5 hours for a spiritual aspirant should be quite enough. He says, if one learns how to consciously reduce one's mental distractions throughout the day, if one learns how to consciously reduce one's mental distractions throughout the day, so much sleep won't be necessary. Of course, if possible, one can have a small break sometime in the afternoon. Even a short cat nap greatly refreshes the mind. But in order to be able to meditate, we should be able to relax. We should learn how to reduce nervous tension. Nervous people find meditation very difficult. But devotees, bhaktas, have an advantage here. How is that? Their spirit of self-surrender, their attitude of dependence on God, that makes it easier for a bhakta to calm the mind, to be in harmony with God's will. That minimizes all their anxieties. If I depend on God and have faith in Him, then I'll be that much less anxious. So, if we are able to maintain an inner current of calmness and peace throughout the day, we won't be needing so much sleep. Then comes the question of food. Sadhakas must at no time overload their stomach with food. Just as everything else, food and drink must be given their proper place, their due place in spiritual life. Fasting or feasting, neither should become an obsession. Let us not overdo either. After a little experimentation, we can all fix the quantity and the type of food that suits our needs. For those who can, fasting once a week or once in a fortnight or so is good. But it doesn't suit certain body constitutions. Such people had better avoid the temptation to fast. There are people who keep trying to fast and failing in it. They're always feeling bad about it. Instead of thinking about God, so much mental energy is wasted in these needless struggles. You don't find any great spiritual master putting too much emphasis on things like this. Next, regarding sadhana, regarding asana or posture suitable for meditation, it is a physical help for concentration. The main practice in all sadhana is concentration and meditation. Everything else is just a preparation for the body and the mind to be in the right condition for it, to be in the right condition for meditation. When the right mood comes, meditation is easy, natural. Then the devotee should sit down in a convenient posture and concentrate their mind. Experience tells that it is good to have two different postures. So we can change from one to the other when we feel the strain of prolonged sitting. What is important here is that we should feel stable, relaxed, comfortable, with the body and head erect. We should be able to sit in this position for at least an hour. Sitting cross-legged on the floor is no doubt the best posture because the weight of the body is perfectly balanced then. But it must also be easy. Otherwise, it disturbs the mind of the sadhaka. But still, this becomes easy and natural after sufficient practice. We are, after all, talking about practice. Practice makes perfect. Now, at this stage, when we are able to sit for a considerable period of time in one position, at this stage, a little practice of rhythmic breathing is very helpful. Even simple pranayama, apart from its being a means to concentration, it is very beneficial to general health. It clears the lungs, steadies the heart, purifies the blood, and it tones up the whole nervous system. Yoga recognizes the fact that the body is not something totally apart from the mind. It is the mind's instrument. So yoga aims at perfecting both body and mind, mainly through asana and pranayama. Pranayama, however, is dangerous for those who can't follow a regulated, quiet life, or for those who cannot be under the constant guidance of a qualified teacher. But there is no harm in practicing just simple rhythmic breathing. I mean, breathing without holding the breath. To begin with, we practice it at definite times. Later on, it becomes a habit, and we'll be able to do it at all times. We don't realize it, but mind and breath are very closely interrelated. Irregular breathing is a tremendous waste of energy, and it makes the mind restless. So, if we want to achieve greater control over ourselves, the functions of the body-mind have to be coordinated, have to be harmonized and made rhythmic. The wheels of the body-mind, of the whole body-mind machine, they have to be made to work in perfect harmony. That is what pranayama achieves. It produces serenity of both body and mind. Then it is a joy to operate this machine. But along with rhythmic breathing, we could also try giving strong suggestions to the mind. Swami Yatishwarananda ji says, imagine that as you inhale purity and exhale impurity. Inhale strength, exhale weakness. Inhale calmness, exhale restlessness. This kind of suggestions prepare the mind later with sufficient practice for proper meditation. So these are all the broader and specific aspects of the spiritual practice of a bhakta. Now, this is quite different from what we heard about Bhakti Yoga in the beginning. If you remember, Bhakti Yoga was supposed to be the path of divine love of God as a spiritual discipline. It was said that this yoga rests on the simple truth that one can realize God just by loving Him. We don't have to do anything else. No physical exercises, no mental gymnastics. It was said that Bhakti Yoga is the easiest of all yogas because it doesn't make any unnatural demand. What it was supposed to do was show us the best possible use we can make of the natural emotion of love, that's all. We were told that it simply teaches us how to turn this powerful natural emotion of love towards God. All we were required to do was love God intensely, just as we love any other thing of the world. But now it appears that bhakti also is not all that simple or easy. Now we have heard so much about the nature of God, the nature of bhakti, preparations for bhakti, forms of bhakti, levels of bhakti, means of bhakti, so on and so forth. But is it necessary that one should go through all this in order to cultivate devotion for God? Of course, yes. Otherwise, the bhakti teachers wouldn't have described them in such great detail. If we were as pure and simple and innocent as little children, as Jesus wants us to be, if we were that, then it would have been quite different. But now we have to learn to become pure and simple and innocent. We have to regain those precious qualities of the heart that we have almost lost. That is why we need all these various disciplines and practices. They are nothing but different ways that lead us back to God, back to our Father, Mother, Friend, and Guide. But it is mainly for the purposes of instruction, in order to facilitate understanding that the sadhanas are divided and subdivided. Long back we saw how dharma or virtue is also divided and subdivided into universal virtues, social virtues, individual virtues, and so on. But moral life is one. In the same way, spiritual life is also one. There is only one God and only one way to Him. But there are different stages in it. And so we have all these different names, that's all. They're all more or less freely chosen according to need. This we have to remember. The names exist mostly in theory. When we actually begin to live the spiritual life, like simple but sincere devotees, when we lead the life, we will be able, from our own experience, to take up or leave out any practice from these lists of sadhanas. True, all these various disciplines are recommendations given by the old masters, and they have their value. But still, it is the spirit behind the instruction that we have to take, not the minute, indistinguishable details. Together with the instructions, the masters themselves have also said that their recommendations have to be adapted, unpassen. Recommendations have to be adapted according to time and necessity. Sri Ramakrishna used to say in a humorous way, I'll tell you so many things, but you have to take what you want and leave what you don't need. One of the teachers, Shandilya Rishi, I don't know if you have heard of him, but he is probably the best known bhakti teacher after Narada. Shandilya Rishi says plainly that when God is pleased, any one of the means, any one of the practices becomes effective. Any one. So, after all is said and done, there is only one thing that is indispensable, and that is the grace of God. I may practice all the sadhanas without exception. I may become known as I may immerse myself in bhakti scriptures. I may become known as a great devotee. But all that will be futile without the grace of the Lord. Even the Upanishads say, this Atman cannot be attained by the study of the Vedas, or by intelligence, or by much hearing of sacred books. It is attained by him alone whom it chooses. It is attained by him alone whom it chooses. To such a one, that is to say, the one whom the Atman chooses, to such a one, Atman reveals its own form. Here, according to dualistic interpreters, Atman indicates the Supreme Lord, Ishvara. So the verse means God can only be seen by the person whom God chooses. Obviously, this emphasizes divine grace. Both self-effort and divine grace are necessary for God realization. But the deciding factor is grace. Through self-effort, we remove obstacles and prepare the ground. But whether God reveals himself or not is left to him. But it is said that when we have done our part of the work, then God does reveal himself spontaneously. So it all means that we cannot realize God by our own efforts. His grace is very necessary. It is He, after all, who dwells in our heart as Atman. It is this indwelling Lord whom we are trying to realize through all our spiritual practices. We are trying to realize Him as one with ourselves. When God is pleased with our sincerity and devotion, He reveals His real nature, His spirit form to us. As long as we are egotistic in our approach, that is to say, as long as we try to know God through external means like spiritual exercises, as long as we attempt to pull God down by the force of our so-called spiritual practice, we fail in our attempt. When all these external means prove inadequate, then we realize how futile the ego is. It is then that we develop self-surrender. It is that attitude of self-surrender that brings down divine grace. And when divine grace descends, it results in God realization. It doesn't mean that self-effort is useless. Without that, we would probably not be able to recognize God when He manifests Himself to us. This is what the masters say. Without self-effort, you will not understand a genuine spiritual experience when it happens. In fact, True self-surrender is a very high spiritual state itself. It is attained only after prolonged struggle, prolonged self-effort. Only one who has really passed through strenuous effort, only that person can give oneself up and surrender oneself wholly, unconditionally at the Lord's feet. All of our spiritual striving and struggle is only to make the mind pure, to make it fit for this total self-surrender. So this only comes after having gone through spiritual discipline with great perseverance, tenacity. It comes only when our wings are dead tired, like the wings of the bird in Sri Ramakrishna's parable. It flies out in all directions, but finally, when it is dead tired, it comes back and sits on the mast, allowing itself to be carried by the ship. So, only the person who has put forth maximum self-effort can know what true self-surrender means. It's not enough to simply say it is all God's will. God's grace is not something random. It is not unpredictable or erratic. Unberechenbar, launish. God's grace is not that. God searches the heart, the inner attitude of the devotee. I can deceive the world. I can deceive myself. But I can't deceive the one who is sitting inside, watching everything from within. He sees through all my so-called spiritual practices. He sees through all my external poses. He sees how much sincerity there is in my heart, and He sends down His grace accordingly. But now, if that is the case, doesn't that make divine grace proportional to, or rather, entirely dependent on my sincerity? That is the question. Then, can it be called grace at all? Can God's grace be conditional? Well, there are two opinions on this point. Some bhakti teachers hold that the devotee's bhakti has to cooperate with God's grace. Our will has to cooperate with God's will. The young monkey has to somehow cling to its mother with great exertion as she carries it over the tree branches. That is one opinion. But others believe that God's grace is unconditional, that it operates independent of our exertions. The kitten does not know how to cling to its mother. It leaves everything to its mother, and the mother cat carries the kitten in her mouth here and there and does what is good for the kitten. Sri Ramakrishna says there are some aspirants who cannot practice spiritual discipline by calculating about japa or the duration of meditation. There are some aspirants who cannot practice spiritual discipline in this calculative way. All they do is cry to God with yearning hearts. God hears their cry and cannot keep himself away. He reveals himself to them. It is this second view that gave rise to the famous doctrine of Prapati. It was the Vaishnavas who developed this special doctrine, the doctrine of Prapati. Prapati means seeking shelter or taking refuge in God. The devotee has only to throw themselves at God's mercy in order to be liberated. It is vanity. Vanity means extreme pride, idle kite. It is vanity to think of my own good deeds, punya karmas, of my own knowledge as qualifications. It is the height of pride. After all, how much are my good deeds or my knowledge compared with my sins, my misdeeds, my ignorance? When I think of those things, I am overwhelmed by the sense of my own littleness before God's infinite mercy. I can only go down on my knees. I can only beg with tears in my eyes, "O Lord, I take refuge in you. I am ignorant, weak, helpless. Do graciously pick me up from the dust and place me in your presence." This is all I can do. But to all such worshippers who seek absolute refuge in Him, the Lord of the Bhagavad Gita has made this grand promise. Abandon all dharmas. Abandon all dharmas and come to me alone for shelter. I will deliver you from all sins. Do not grieve. It is one of the greatest promises God has made to us. Abandon all dharmas and come to me alone for shelter. I will deliver you from all sins. Don't grieve. The thing is, even in our practice of spiritual disciplines, even in our acts of devotion, there is a form of renunciation to be practiced. Very often we see a tendency in sadhakas to feel that we have done so much sadhana and still nothing much has happened. A complaining attitude. Or that we are entitled to God's grace because we have done so much spiritual practice. There is nothing so stupid, nothing so unspiritual as this kind of mentality. The infinite cannot be bought for any price. A true bhakta abandons the fruits of all their sadhanas to God. The Lord will send His grace according to His will. Our duty is only to pray for it and wait for it patiently. Abandoning all dharmas includes surrendering not only the fruits of all our actions, but also the sense of doership. I must not even feel that I am the doer. And this, even with regard to my spiritual practices. We must take care that sadhana doesn't itself become egocentric, because that can also happen. In fact, that happens very frequently. With an attitude of great humility, we must remain in the faith that God is our only support, our only Savior, and that He will do what is good for us. And one who takes refuge in God absolutely, God promises to release from all sins. The word sin has to be understood in a comprehensive sense. It includes the effects of all our karma, past and present, good and bad. Everything which leads to repeated births and deaths. In this sense, the effects of even good karmas are sins, because they also lead to repeated births and deaths. Swami Vivekananda said that a golden chain is not any the less strong to bind. The golden chain will also bind us. So when the Lord gives refuge to the devotees, what happens is His grace lights the lamp of wisdom that removes the darkness of ignorance. Ignorance, which is the cause of all sin. Long ago we heard that there are atonements, acts of expiation, Sühnung, for individual sins. But how can I get rid of the tendency to sin? That is more important. If I don't get rid of the tendency to sin, I'll keep sinning again and again. So, how can I get rid of the tendency to sin? Bhakti teachers say only God's grace can do it. So, take refuge in Him, and He will give you shelter and free you from the fear of samsara. So, this is the last word in the religion of love, Prapati. Bhakti, as we have heard, is intense, all-absorbing love of God. It reaches its culmination in perfect self-surrender, taking complete, total refuge in God, the Master. The devotee is convinced beyond doubt that nothing happens which is against their welfare. God may not do what makes me happy. God will do what is good for me. So the lover of God welcomes misery, pain, even the terror of death. This total self-resignation to God's will, that is in fact far greater than any kind of spiritual heroism. A quiet, lifelong attitude of resignation to God's will. A bhakta is ready to sacrifice themselves in the service of any of the Lord's creatures. Buddha is known to have offered his life in order to save the life of a goat out of compassion. A devotee doesn't injure anybody because everybody is God's creature. In this world of 2 days, evanescent world, everything comes to an end. So the bhakta makes the highest use of life by holding it at the service of others. What is it that makes one selfish? It is the consciousness of the body. That is why we are selfish. But even body consciousness presents no obstacle to bhaktas, because bhaktas know positively that their body is God's instrument. They don't feel that it is their body. It is God's instrument and it should be used to serve His creatures. This is true self-surrender. So the devotee's attitude is, let things come as they may. Lord, yours will be done. So through love and surrender, the bhakta knows the mysteries of the Lord, takes refuge in Him, becomes absorbed in Him, and attains immortality. At the end of the 12th chapter, Bhakti Yoga, at the end of that chapter of the Gita, Krishna gives a detailed description of the devotee whom he considers to be perfect. What kind of devotee does God love? It is not enough for us to love God. Whom does God love? Krishna's portrayal of an ideal devotee runs over nearly 10 verses. He says, he who never hates any being and is friendly and compassionate to all, who is free from the feelings of I and mine, even-minded in pain and pleasure, who is forbearing, ever content, and steady in contemplation, who is self-controlled and possessed of firm conviction, that is, conviction about the spiritual nature of God, and who has consecrated his mind and intelligence to me. Krishna says, dear to me is the one who is thus devoted to me. He by whom the world is not afflicted, and whom the world cannot afflict either. He who is free from joy and anger, fear and anxiety, he is dear to me. He who is free from dependence, who is pure and prompt, unconcerned and untroubled, and who has renounced all undertakings, dear to me is the man who is thus devoted to me. He who rejoices not and hates not, who grieves not and desires not, who has renounced both good and evil, and is full of devotion, he is dear to me. He who is alike to friend and foe, unchanged in honor and dishonor, who is the same in cold and heat, in pleasure and pain, who is free from attachment, who is unchanged by praise and blame, quiet, content with whatever he has, without possessions, firm of faith, and full of devotion, that man is dear to me. And finally, Krishna says, exceedingly dear to me are those who regard me as the supreme goal, and endowed with faith and devotion, follow this immortal dharma. This immortal dharma means the practice of the spiritual virtues that have been described in these several verses. Such devotees are exceedingly dear to God. We could use these verses for meditation. But then, it is surprising that in this long description of the perfect devotee, there is hardly any mention of love. about which we have said and heard so much. Almost no mention of love as a sentiment. Krishna is talking more of renunciation and detachment than anything else. That is very surprising. But if you meditate on these verses, the message becomes clear. Without renouncing the world, there can be no love of God. Without viyoga, detachment from the world, there can be no yoga, union with God. Without viraga, dispassion for the world, there can be no anuraga, passion for God. Swami Vivekananda also says, renunciation is the central teaching of all religions, of all paths. Because without that, we won't be able to love God. So, with this, we now conclude our study of Bhakti Yoga. Thank you very much.